What if I told you the man who cried the loudest for Charlie Kirk might have been using his name to make money the whole time? Stay with me because what I found will change how you see Brandon Tatum forever. When news broke that Charlie Kirk had been shot on September 10, 2025, it genuinely seemed like Brandon Tatum was deeply shaken by the incident. He appeared heartbroken, posting emotional videos in support of Kirk, shedding tears on camera, and even calling out others for what he saw as insincere reactions. Among those he criticized were Nick Fuentes and a creator known as Admiring Gains. For a while, his emotion felt completely authentic, but that perception began to shift when the YouTuber Saint in the Center released a revealing video that changed how many people viewed the situation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
He already deep into character.
I know some of you guys may have heard the news.
This guy
Charlie
is the worst.
This guy
is the worst. Oh
you know,
goodness.
I haven't watched
Bro, you
video.
You care
0%.
At first, I hadn't considered it that way, but the senator noticed something that I completely missed. He suggested that the entire display of emotion was staged. That Brandon Tatum's concern for Charlie Kirk wasn't genuine at all. My first instinct was disbelief, almost defensive, as if the accusation itself felt unfair. After all, in those first chaotic hours following the news of Charlie Kirk's shooting, so many people seemed to be grieving. Brandon's voice cracked in his videos, his eyes looked glassy, his tone heavy with emotion. It was easy to believe he was heartbroken. For anyone watching, including myself, he appeared to be one of the few who was sincerely devastated. To imagine that his tears might have been an performance meant to evoke sympathy or maintain credibility felt too cynical, even cruel. But the senator's observation lingered in the back of my mind. It was one of those comments that you initially dismiss but can't quite shake off. He said it with such quiet certainty, like someone who had seen this kind of behavior before. Watch closely, he'd told me, and see what happens next. At the time, I brushed it aside. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more the senator's words started to haunt me. Could it be that beneath the surface of those emotional videos lay something strategic? Something designed not from heartbreak but from calculation. Saint in the Center, a YouTuber known for analyzing online personalities and political influencers, later echoed the same idea. He didn't personally know Brandon Tatum or Charlie Kirk, but he had a knack for dissecting public behavior, looking beyond what people said to what their actions revealed. When he claimed that Tatum's grief seemed performative, I wanted to reject it outright. He doesn't know them, I told myself. He's just speculating. Yet, part of me began to wonder whether the lack of personal connection might actually make his take more objective. He wasn't swayed by friendships, alliances, or the kind of emotional loyalty that can cloud judgment. He was watching from the outside, detached but observant. Still, I resisted the idea for as long as I could. I had seen Brandon Tatum's earlier work, his fiery speeches, his commentaries about faith, politics, and personal responsibility. He came across as passionate, driven, and unafraid to stand up for what he believed in. It didn't seem possible that someone like that could fake such visible distress over the injury of a supposed friend. And yet, when new details began to surface, my certainty started to waver. First came the reports that Tatum hadn't been invited to speak at Charlie Kirk's memorial. That revelation surprised a lot of people. On social media, fans expressed confusion. Why wouldn't someone who had once appeared side by side with Kirk, both in interviews and at events, be given a chance to share a few words in his honor? It was a subtle but telling detail. If the bond between them was as strong as Tatum had presented it to be, the organizers' decision to exclude him raised uncomfortable questions. Was there tension between them before Kirk's death? Had something happened behind the scenes that the public didn't know about? Then came the next twist. Instead of keeping the focus on Kirk's legacy, Tatum began to pivot toward his own story, his personal struggles, the difficulties he faced, and how misunderstood he felt by his peers in the conservative movement. It was subtle at first, but noticeable. His tone shifted from mournful reflection to self-justification, as though the tragedy had become a backdrop for his own narrative of exclusion and unfair treatment. To many viewers, it might have seemed like a natural emotional reaction. Grief often intertwines with self-reflection, but when placed alongside the senator's earlier warning, it took on a different light. It was as if Tatum was using the public's sympathy for Charlie Kirk to remind them of his own relevance, to keep his name at the center of the conversation. I began to see how easily grief can be transformed into a platform, how quickly mourning can become monetized or politicized. In the digital age, Sincerity and strategy often blur until they're indistinguishable. A tear on camera can be genuine pain or it can be content. I found myself revisiting those videos again. This time watching not for emotion but for intention. Every pause, every inflection, every sigh seemed rehearsed. There was a rhythm to it, the practiced pacing of someone who knows how to keep an audience engaged. And yet, I didn't want to believe it. Part of me still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. To think that maybe he was just trying to process everything in his own imperfect way. But as more information trickled in, that line of defense became harder to maintain. Friends of Kirk, speaking anonymously, hinted that there had been friction between the two men in the months before the shooting. Professional jealousy, ideological differences, and personal pride were all whispered as possible factors. Brandon's exclusion from the memorial began to seem less like an oversight and more like a deliberate choice. Even his later attempts to explain it, away claiming he was fine with it, that he didn't need recognition, felt strained. It's easy to say you don't care about being left out when you've already been left out publicly. Looking back, the senator's skepticism now seemed less harsh and more perceptive. He had seen through the performance before the rest of us did. In the world of political commentary and influencer culture, authenticity has become its own kind of currency. Audiences reward those who appear real, and tears, outrage, or vulnerability can translate directly into clicks, views, and merchandise sales. Once I understood that, Brandon's behavior began to make a troubling kind of sense. Maybe his display of emotion wasn't about Charlie Kirk at all, it was about protecting his own brand. The optics of being a loyal friend, the grieving comrade standing by his fallen ally, offered an opportunity to reaffirm his position in the movement and remind viewers of his moral standing. If he could align himself with Kirk's legacy in the moment of tragedy, he could share in the sympathy pouring out from the public. As harsh as it sounds, that realization hit me like a cold wave. It wasn't just disappointment, it was disillusionment. I began to see how performative grief operates in the influencer sphere. The camera becomes both confessional and stage. And every tear has potential value. When the senator first said Brandon's concern was fake, I thought he was being cynical. Now I saw he was simply being realistic. In hindsight, everything fit together too neatly. The emotional videos, the sudden self-promotion afterward, the shift from tribute to personal grievance. It all followed a pattern that's become disturbingly familiar in digital spaces where tragedy meets opportunity. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. What I had mistaken for heartfelt mourning might have been one of the most calculated acts of all. By the time the full story unfolded, Brandon Tatum's exclusion from the memorial, his pivot toward his own issues, and his increasingly defensive tone, it no longer seemed implausible that the senator had been right from the start. What once sounded like an outlandish accusation now appeared to be a sharp, accurate observation of human nature in the social media age. In the end, it wasn't just about Brandon Tatum or Charlie Kirk. It was about how easily the line between authenticity and performance blurs when the spotlight never turns off. The senator's words echoed louder than ever. Watch closely and see what happens next. And when I finally did, I realized he had been right all along.
Not invited to any of the Turning Point Faith events, which I'm one of the biggest Christians in the movement right now that stand up for Jesus Christ on every platform that I've ever been on. But I didn't cry and say, I said, you know what? I understand, man. God gave me a platform that's bigger than any platform you can give me anyway. So I can do my own Christian stuff on my own platform. I'm not tripping, bro. I'll still do the thing because I care about the kids. I care about the young people. I'm on campus with these young people. I see the sacrifice they make. I'm on campus. I will support.
He expressed his frustration, saying something along the lines of, I wasn't invited to Turning Point USA's Christian Summit. Even though I'm one of the most outspoken Christians in the movement, it just doesn't make sense. It feels unfair that I wasn't included. Yet, despite his clear disappointment, he claimed he chose not to make a scene about it. I didn't say anything. He added, I just took it on the chin. From there, he continued his thoughts, hinting at deeper feelings of exclusion and disillusionment within the movement he once passionately supported.
And Charlie Kirk, I didn't like the fact that they did that. I was upset with Charlie Kirk over that, but I never talked to him about it, so it wasn't a big deal. If I really was mad enough, I would have called him. But I was like, it's all right, man. If they don't want me to speak because of something else, when they got Tucker up here talking bad about Jews, I said it is what it is. That's not my place. I don't run the organization. If I don't like it, I don't have to work with them. But I do love Charlie, and I do love what Turning Point stands for. So I say I'm going to work within the capacity that God has called me to do, and whatever I can do to support.
He pressed forward with his own narrative, insisting that he'd been mistreated and unfairly excluded. Yet, he couldn't help but point out that Tucker Carlson had been invited to the Christian Summit, a fact that seemed to sting deeply. His resentment made a bit more sense when you realized how much disdain he held for Carlson, whom he had labeled an anti-Semite. The irony was hard to ignore. Tucker Carlson had spoken at Charlie Kirk's funeral, while Brandon Tatum had not even been given the opportunity. That alone suggested that Carlson had a far closer bond with both Kirk and Turning Point USA. Naturally, Tatum felt snubbed. It was especially painful considering his history. He was one of the earliest prominent black conservatives to gain traction on the right, helping launch the Blexit movement and broadening Turning Point's reach into black conservative circles. Yet despite his contributions, he found himself increasingly sidelined. Tatum believed this exclusion was driven by sponsors who didn't want him involved. But the lingering question remained, why didn't they want him there? Even as these issues mounted, Tatum seemed unwilling to confront them directly. Like Vickian, other figure known for avoiding uncomfortable truths, he refused to answer the phone to face what was really happening. Instead, he leaned on his faith, emphasizing again and again, "We're all Christians, why wouldn't they invite me? I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, we're all Christians." But as one commentator bluntly put it, "Brandon, it's not about being Christian, it's about being black." That remark, which went viral thanks to a TikTok creator known as Theorod, cut straight to the point. He reminded Tatum that no matter how much he assimilated marrying a white woman, having mixed-race children, or trying to blend seamlessly into the conservative establishment, he would never be seen as white. And truthfully, Tatum wasn't a particularly divisive figure on the right. He avoided confrontation unless it involved left-wing critics or those who opposed Israel. Yet, signs of bitterness had been building for a while. His frustration began to surface publicly when he started making subtle jabs at Charlie Kirk himself. Not long before Kirk's tragic death, reports surfaced that he had lost a $2 million donor over his stance on Israel, a devastating blow that allegedly left him ready to walk away. When Candace Owens later leaked text messages confirming this, Tatum spoke out, arguing that such private messages should never have been made public because Kirk was no longer alive to defend himself. But beneath that moral stance, people began noticing something else, a growing undercurrent of resentment and unresolved tension that hinted Tatum's frustrations with Kirk went much deeper than he cared to admit.
To say, well, let's have an investment or investors, and an investor says, okay, Brandon, I really like what you're doing, man. I like how you stand up for Israel. I like what you do for law enforcement. I like how you're conservative. And I want to give you $2 million a year for the next 5 years to help you build your platform and help you build your company. And then year 2, I start platforming people who are anti-Semitic. I start giving credence to people who are saying things that are antithetical to the mission in which the donor started or the investor started with me on. And investors say, look, man, I don't want to invest in this anymore.
And there it was, Brandon Tatum, a man who had long promoted himself as one of Charlie Kirk's closest allies, suddenly turning his words against him. The moment was startling, not because disagreements between friends are rare, but because of the context. Tatum wasn't criticizing a colleague in a healthy debate. He was publicly faulting Charlie Kirk for the loss of a $2 million donor, an accusation that carried an unmistakable sting, especially considering Kirk was no longer alive to respond. What made it all the more jarring was the timing. In that very same video, just minutes before taking this jab, Tatum had solemnly declared that people should refrain from talking about the situation at all. His reasoning seemed noble on the surface. Charlie can't defend himself, he said, implying that any further commentary would be disrespectful to the memory of his late friend. Yet within moments, he contradicted that principle by doing exactly what he had condemned, casting judgment on the man's choices and, by extension, his legacy. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. It stood out like a crack in a mirror that once reflected sincerity. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he spoke in anger. Maybe his grief clouded his judgment. After all, people often lash out when dealing with loss, especially when that loss is sudden in public. But the more I listened, the harder it became to give him the benefit of the doubt. His tone didn't carry the raw shakiness of someone mourning a friend, it carried the sharp edge of someone settling a score. There was something deliberate in his phrasing, as if the moment of vulnerability had turned into an opportunity to assert moral superiority. That was when the bigger picture began to reveal itself. This wasn't just about grief. It wasn't even just about Charlie Kirk. It was about ego, resentment, and pride, the invisible forces that can turn colleagues into competitors and friends into rivals. Tatum's words seemed less like the reflections of a grieving friend and more like the grievances of a man who felt sidelined, unappreciated, and left behind by the very movement he helped build. To understand why this moment felt so significant, you have to look at the larger story of Brandon Tatum himself. He wasn't always the towering figure of online conservatism he is now. He began as a police officer turned commentator, rising to prominence through bold, unapologetic takes that resonated with conservative audiences hungry for authenticity. His partnership with Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk played a crucial role in his rise. Together, they represented a new, younger generation of right-wing influencers, articulate and fearless in the face of criticism. But success, especially in the world of online politics, is rarely a shared spotlight. The conservative influencer ecosystem is competitive, and personal brands often collide with collective missions. Over time, cracks began to form, small disagreements, subtle rivalries, and unspoken envy. Tatum, one of the earliest black conservatives to gain a following through Blexit and his work with Kirk, may have felt that his contributions were being overlooked as others gained more visibility and institutional influence, so when he wasn't invited to speak at Charlie Kirk's memorial, the omission must have stung deeply. Publicly, he played it off. Privately, the exclusion may have confirmed his worst fears that he had become a disposable figure in the very movement he helped energize. That kind of wound, professional rejection wrapped in personal betrayal, cuts deep, and when not properly addressed, it festers, eventually manifesting as bitterness disguised as honesty. That's why this moment of criticism toward Kirk felt less like an accidental slip and more like a glimpse into long-simmering resentment. The loss of the donor wasn't just a factual point for Tatum, it was a symbol, a way to assert that maybe, just maybe, Charlie Kirk wasn't as flawless as everyone had painted him. It was his subtle way of saying, "See, you all idolized him, but I knew his flaws too." In his mind, this might have been an act of truth-telling, but to the public, it came across as opportunistic, a friend taking aim at a fallen ally who could no longer speak for himself. Ironically, this wasn't even the primary reason people were watching that video. Tatum had originally made it as a response to D.L. Hughley, a comedian who had criticized conservative figures for their hypocrisy and racial politics. Viewers clicked, expecting a fiery clapback, but instead stumbled upon a much more revealing spectacle: a man unraveling before his own audience. It was as though his attempt to defend himself against one controversy accidentally exposed a far deeper web of contradictions and insecurities he hadn't intended to show. The juxtaposition was almost poetic. Here was Tatum, lecturing others about fairness and restraint, while embodying the very behavior he condemned, and in doing so, he illuminated one of the core paradoxes of modern influencer culture. Authenticity has become a performance. We live in a time when public vulnerability can be monetized, when outrage and grief are both currencies, and when being real often means being strategic. Brandon Tatum wasn't the first to fall into this trap, but he exemplified it perfectly. As I watched him speak, I couldn't help but think about the psychology behind it. People who live in the public eye often start believing in the narratives they build around themselves. When you spend years projecting strength, righteousness, and leadership, it becomes almost impossible to admit weakness or insecurity. Instead, every slight trial or imagine gets reframed as injustice. Every moment of exclusion becomes proof that you're misunderstood or persecuted. Tatum's decision to attack Kirk may not have been born purely out of malice. It could have stemmed from that desperate need to reclaim control, to reassert importance in a world that had momentarily moved on without him. But the tragedy is that, in doing so, he only validated his critics. What should have been a quiet reflection on friendship, legacy, and loss turned into a self-inflicted wound. By weaponizing Charlie Kirk's absence to make a point about his own struggles, he confirmed exactly what skeptics like Saint in the Center had suspected all along: that his loyalty was conditional, his empathy performative. It's a sad truth about human nature that even the most genuine relationships can be overshadowed by ego. In Tatum's case, the moment of contradiction exposed more than hypocrisy, revealed the fragile architecture of his public identity. Behind the confident tone, the neatly trimmed suits, and the sermons about integrity was a man grappling with doubt, resentment, and the gnawing fear of being forgotten. And that's what makes this episode so compelling and, frankly, heartbreaking. It isn't just a story about one man criticizing another. It's about the cost of ambition, the loneliness of public life, and the moral corrosion that can occur when personal validation becomes more important than truth. Watching Brandon Tatum's words turn against the very person he claimed to admire was like watching a bridge collapse in slow motion, a structure built on shared values suddenly crumbling under the weight of pride. What began as a simple video response to a celebrity comedian ended up exposing something much deeper: the fragility of authenticity in the digital age. And for those who had once believed in Brandon Tatum's sincerity, this moment marked a turning point, a realization that sometimes the loudest defenders of integrity are the ones struggling hardest to find their own.
What you guys don't realize is that once you are done with your life and you can't bring in income anymore, that's detrimental to a person's family. Charlie Kirk had a show that was tremendously successful. It's a dog-eat-dog world. They're not finna keep his show going. They're gonna cut his show after probably another week or so, and they're gonna put somebody else in that spot. You're talking millions of dollars coming into his family that's no longer there. Unrealized gains. Charlie Kirk probably would have wrote 40 more books. Charlie Kirk should have lived another 50 years. And his children and his wife are not gonna have that unrealized gain from Charlie Kirk's legacy moving forward. So this is a contributing option for us that love him, that really love him.
What happened next took the situation from questionable to outright alarming. During one of his videos, Brandon Tatum suddenly shifted gears and began urging viewers to visit tatumstore.com, his personal merchandise site. He presented it as a way to support Charlie Kirk's legacy, encouraging fans to buy shirts, mugs, and even license plate frames branded in Kirk's name. At first, it sounded like a heartfelt fundraising effort, but when I looked closer, things didn't add up. Turning Point USA, the organization Charlie Kirk founded, was already thriving financially even after his passing. At the memorial, Tucker Carlson reportedly helped raise $5.4 million, personally donating $1 million of his own money. With that level of financial support, why would Tatum need to sell his own tribute merchandise? So I did a little digging. It turns out, Turning Point USA already sells its own official gear, shirts, mugs, and a lower price, with proceeds going directly to the organization and Kirk's family. Which raises the obvious question: if Tatum's goal was really to help, why didn't he just direct people there? The answer seems painfully clear. By funneling people to his own store instead of the official source, Tatum ensured that he pocketed the profits. And since there's no transparency about how much of that money, if any, actually went to Charlie Kirk's family, the whole operation looks more like a self-serving cash grab than a tribute. It's hard not to see this as manipulative. Influencers rarely interrupt their own videos to make ads that don't benefit them directly. And this situation was no exception. What makes it worse is the irony. Charlie Kirk was one of the people who helped elevate Tatum's platform in the first place, providing opportunities and funding early in his career. Now, in the wake of Kirk's death, Tatum appeared to be exploiting his image for profit. If he truly wanted to honor his late friend, the ethical move would have been simple: remove Kirk's likeness from his products, stop monetizing the tragedy, and direct all support to Turning Point USA or the family directly. Anything less makes his motives look hollow. Sadly, this episode exposes a darker side of influencer culture where loyalty, morality, and friendship can easily get lost in the pursuit of clicks, clout, and cash.